Charles Yelverton O'Connor was Engineer-in-Chief for the state of Western Australia and was responsible for the development of Fremantle Harbour, much of the state's early railway network, but it was the Kalgoorlie water pipeline that was to be his greatest success, even though he didn't live to see it. His story is one of both triumph and tragedy, and for a long time many people have been lied to about what happened. Charles was born in Gravelmount, Castletown, County Meath in Ireland, on the 11th of January 1843. He was the third son of John O'Connor and his wife Mary Elizabeth. Initially, he gained his working experience articled to John Challoner Smith, engineer on the Waterford to Kilkenny Railway. He worked in railway construction in the southwest of Ireland and in water control works in the north. Soon after graduating, O'Connor moved to New Zealand in 1865, where he was responsible for the construction of roads and bridges. After 7 years, he was appointed district engineer for Canterbury, and in March 1874 he married a Scottish woman named Susan Letitia Ness at Holy Trinity Church in Avonside. O'Connor's work in New Zealand was very demanding. The nature of the terrain meant that construction of roads and bridges was no simple matter. The work he did there provided a great depth of experience, and that was to serve him well later in his career. After 18 years in New Zealand, he was offered the position of Under-Secretary for Public Works. This meant giving up his practical engineering work and becoming more of an administrator. O'Connor accepted the position and moved to Wellington, and was there from 1883 to 1890. In 1890, his job was amalgamated with that of the chief engineer, and O'Connor was offered the position of marine engineer, despite the fact that he was better qualified for the newly created position. An economic downturn in New Zealand and a change of government left O'Connor feeling insecure about the future. Meanwhile, in far-off Western Australia, the newly elected Premier, John Forrest, was looking for people to fill important positions in the independent colony. Initially, he tried to entice H.S. Mace, former Chief Engineer of South Australia, to the position of Chief Engineer. But Mace was in private practice and didn't want the problems of reorganising a new department. Mace was already making about £1,800 a year, and the government salary of $1,250 was hardly going to be an inducement. At a conference in Sydney, Forrest first heard the name O'Connor. Being very impressed with what he was told about O'Connor, Forrest offered him the position of Chief Engineer, but at a salary of only £1,000. O'Connor turned this down, and the offer was raised to $1,200. By the time he left, O'Connor had spent some 26 years in New Zealand, but the final 2 had been filled with disappointment and frustration, and it was this, more than anything else, that probably made up O'Connor's mind to move. In May 1891, Charles Yelverton O'Connor was appointed Engineer-in-Chief for the independent colony of Western Australia. New Zealand's loss was definitely our gain. He was immediately thrown in the deep end when he arrived. Work had piled up, and urgent requests to get the railways and Fremantle port sorted out were already filling his in-tray when he first sat down behind his desk. O'Connor was the new boy in town, and had a lot of responsibility and a lot of power when it came to handing out contracts for public works. There was an established old boys network in Perth, and a strong distrust of t'othersiders and anyone not from the local establishment. O'Connor brought in staff he knew and trusted, men who had worked for him in New Zealand. His choice was made because these were men he knew and could rely on, and there was simply no one in WA with the experience or qualifications to fill the positions. H.W. Venn, Minister for Railways, defended O'Connor's choice of staff and was to stand by the Chief Engineer for as long as he remained Minister. O'Connor's choice of staff was seen by local interests as favouring outsiders over locals, and when O'Connor started handing out contracts based on the best price rather than who was tendering, feathers got even more ruffled. The fact that one of his first contracts went to the Wilkie brothers, who were New Zealanders, infuriated a number of people. In reality, theirs was the lowest tender, some £13,000 less than the nearest tender, and they completed the job 9 months early. Although John Forrest was always one of O'Connor's staunchest allies, his brother, Alexander Forrest, was strongly critical of the new chief engineer. In one tirade directed at O'Connor, Alexander said, "In 10 years' time, we may as well hand over the whole colony to this gentleman from New Zealand, who will no doubt show us how to spend our money." Alexander went on to falsely claim, under parliamentary privilege, that O'Connor had been dismissed in New Zealand. Later, Alexander was forced to admit that O'Connor had a beneficial impact on the state's railways, and they were greatly improved. Fremantle Harbour was his first major undertaking, and it took 5 years to complete. The original proposal was for a harbour to be built some distance south of the mouth of the Swan River, at Owen Anchorage. This was neither practical in the long term, or even safe in the short term. Originally, even John Forrest favoured this location, but slowly his mind was changed as O'Connor presented the facts relating to long-term viability. When the motion for Owen Anchorage was defeated in Parliament, John graciously accepted the advice from O'Connor and put his considerable weight behind the project. During the harbour project, there were more claims that O'Connor was filling positions with too many New Zealanders. When this was checked by Minister Venn, there were found to be only 11 New Zealanders out of a workforce of 173. On May 4, 1897, the ship Sultan was the first ship of any size to enter the new harbour. When the harbour work was completed, it came in £20,000 under budget. Few people are aware of it today, but a large rock bar blocked the entrance to the Swan River and prevented it being used as a harbour, so most ships were using Albany as the main port until the rock bar was removed and the harbour facility developed at Fremantle. Over 1 million cubic feet of rock was removed from the rock bar. Most of it ended up being used in the North and South Moles. O'Connor's attention was next diverted to the state of the railways in Western Australia. Prior to his arrival, 188 miles of track and rolling stock managed to operate at a loss for 9 of the 12 years it had been in operation. Shortly after O'Connor arrived, the railways became profitable and remained so for a long time. A further 400 miles of track was laid during the next 5 years. Although he was eventually to give up administration of the railways, something he was quite grateful for, O'Connor continued to be involved in planning new routes and maintaining existing lines. History tells us that O'Connor first suggested the idea of a pipeline to the goldfields in 1895, but opposition was so strong that it took until 1898 to get approval. Even when the project eventually got underway, he was subjected to public ridicule, mostly by the press. The scheme to build a pipeline 329 miles from Mundaring to Kalgoorlie was an astonishing one. Mundaring sits just 340 feet above sea level, with Kalgoorlie about 1,400 feet. Water would have to be pumped uphill most of the way. The project was massive, both in engineering terms and in terms of what it would cost. If successful, it would undoubtedly make the engineer responsible for it world famous. O'Connor was said to be too keen to make a name for himself and was putting the state into debt to get the project accepted and make himself rich. He was criticised for underestimating the rainfall in the goldfields and for not considering other ideas like dams. The fact was, the rainfall figures he presented turned out to be correct, and he had considered dams, but the rainfall was too low, the evaporation rate too high, and the ground unsuited to holding water. Charles submitted plans for the water scheme to a panel of experts in London in 1897. 3 British engineers commended the scheme as entirely practical. Despite this, opposition to the pipeline continued in WA. New claims that the pipeline was not O'Connor's idea are backed up by O'Connor himself, who tried to distance himself from the popular belief that he was the originator of the idea. In view of this, the Sunday Times, that went on to hound poor O'Connor to his untimely death, writing articles about O'Connor's fancy project, had an awful lot to answer for. In one libellous attack, the Sunday Times wrote of O'Connor, "This Shire engineer from New Zealand has absolutely flourished on palm grease. The man has exhibited such gross blundering, or something worse, in his management of great public works, that it is by no means an exaggeration that he has robbed the taxpayers of this state out of millions." O'Connor was not to know it at the time, but the dismissal of Henry Whittle Venn by John Forrest in 1896 was the first gathering of clouds on his horizon. He had lost an important ally, and would lose more before having to face the storms ahead alone. In 1901, when John Forrest left state politics to join the federal arena, he asked O'Connor to compile a report on a transcontinental railway from Kalgoorlie to Port Augusta in South Australia. On May 19, 1901, O'Connor presented the plans and estimates. In 1902, O'Connor went to South Australia to advise the government there on an outer harbour for Adelaide. All the while, the criticism in WA continued. Claims that O'Connor was corrupt or profited in any way from his office have since been proven to be total fabrications. When he died, he was a relatively poor man, and but for a small life insurance policy, his family would have been destitute. With an incredible workload, heavy responsibility, and continuing pressure from the critics, O'Connor's mental health began to suffer. This brilliant professional man, who had achieved so much, now began to question his ability to complete the work. He had difficulty at times doing simple sums, and would fall silent or switch topics during conversation, and showed all the signs of falling into deep depression. His allies, Venn and Forrest, had moved on, and even his doctor, who may have been able to avert disaster, was away. On the 8th of March 1902, a successful preliminary pumping test of 6 miles of the water main that ran over the most difficult part of the route was carried out. A small leak was found near Chidlow's well, and O'Connor had arranged to visit and inspect the pipe the following Monday. Apparently, the mounting pressure and the lack of support had simply become too much for O'Connor. Attacked at every turn and facing inquiry after inquiry, his spirit finally broke. He took his horse and rode along the beach near Rob's Jetty. He then shot himself with a pistol. The following note was found on his desk. "The position has become impossible. Anxious impossible work to do and 3 commissions of inquiry to attend to. We may not have done as well as possible in the past, but we will necessarily be hampered to do well in the imminent future. I feel that my brain is suffering, and I am in great fear of what effect all this worry will have upon me. I have lost control of my thoughts. The Kalgoorlie scheme is all right, and I could finish it if I got the chance, and protection from misrepresentation. But there's no hope of that now, and it's better that it should be given to some entirely new man to do, who will be untrammelled by prior responsibility. Put the wing walls to Helena Weir at once." O'Connor was obviously in turmoil, and this amounts to a suicide note. But even in his final words, "put the wing to Helena Weir at once," he is still concerned that the work is to carry on to completion. What an absolutely tragic loss to the state. Even worse was the fact that O'Connor's daughter, Bridget, who usually accompanied him on his morning rides, had not been feeling well that fateful day and did not go with him. She blamed herself for his death for the rest of her life. The wicked slander sheet, the Sunday Times, was unrepentant, even after they hounded O'Connor to his grave. They wrote, "No honourable, strong-minded man is afraid of the strongest public criticism." At the opening of the Kalgoorlie pipeline on the 24th of January 1903, John Forrest is quoted as saying, "I pay tribute to the memory of O'Connor, the great builder of this work. I am greatly saddened he did not live to receive the honour so justly due to him." Not only was Charles Yelverton O'Connor's death tragic, it was a loss to his loving family. It was surely a great blow to the state. In hindsight, we can see that O'Connor always conducted himself in an honourable, professional manner. His projects were of immeasurable benefit to Western Australia, and today he is honoured for his achievements. The electoral division of O'Connor was named after him. The saddest part of this tragic tale is the fact that had he waited just 10 short months, he would have seen the water reach the goldfields. He would have seen the benefits of Fremantle Harbour, and he could have lived out his life with his family, happy in the knowledge that he had done his newfound home proud. 2 of Charles's 3 surviving sons became engineers, and 2 of his 4 daughters married engineers. Today, if you visit the beach near the site of Rob's Jetty, you'll see out in the ocean a figure of a horse and rider. The rider is slightly turned and looking back at the shore. This is the place where O'Connor is said to have taken his life. The statue has an unnerving, haunting quality and reminds us of a tragedy that happened there so long ago. Another monument to O'Connor was constructed in Fremantle in 1912. It stands at the entrance to the Port Authority buildings, and from up high on a plinth, O'Connor looks deep in thought as he ponders what we have done in his absence. I hope he is not disappointed.